The smell of gunpowder never really leaves your nostrils after you come back from a war. My name is Steve Bradley, a former U.S. Marine, and I carry with me memories that many would rather forget. Today, at the age of 75, I've decided to share my experience during the Tet Offensive, specifically in the Battle of Hue, a moment that changed not only my life but also the course of the war in Vietnam. It was January 1968 when it all began. I was only 21 years old and serving in the 1st Battalion of the 5th Marine Regiment. We were young, proud, and, honestly, completely unprepared for what was to come. Our unit was stationed near Hue, the ancient imperial city, when all hell broke loose. The first sign that something was wrong came with the deafening sound of explosions in the early hours of the morning. It wasn't the usual sporadic gunfire or small ambushes we were used to. It was something different, something bigger. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army had launched a coordinated attack on the entire city. I remember Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran from Puerto Rico who always kept his cool, even in the most tense situations, gathering our squad quickly. "Guys, this is no ordinary attack. They're here to stay," he said, with that serious expression we had learned to respect. Our first mission was to advance across the Nguyen Hong Bridge, which connected the two parts of the city divided by the Perfume River. The scene was surreal. The former imperial city, with its historic buildings and centuries-old architecture, had been transformed into an urban battlefield. The streets that were once filled with civilians were now deserted, except for the combatants on both sides. Mike O'Brien, my best friend in the platoon, was by my side when we made our first contact with the enemy. We were advancing down the main street when bursts of AK-47s began to rain down on us. The metallic sound of bullets ricocheting off the walls was mixed with shouts of order and the firing of our own M16. "Bradley, cover on the right," shouted O'Brien as we took cover behind a partially destroyed wall. The air was heavy with concrete dust and smoke from explosives. Every corner, every window, every roof could hide an enemy sniper. The next few hours turned into an urban nightmare. House-to-house combat was something for which basic training had not adequately prepared us. The Viet Cong knew every alleyway, every secret passage in the city. They had turned homes into bunkers, schools into command posts. One of the most intense moments was when we encountered resistance in an old Buddhist temple. The place that was supposed to be a sanctuary of peace had been transformed into an enemy stronghold. Rodriguez organized our approach with surgical precision. "Stay together. Check every corner twice," he instructed as we advanced. The combat inside the temple was brutal. There was no room for elaborate maneuvers, only direct confrontations in narrow corridors. The sound of the fighting echoed off the ancient walls, creating a disorienting cacophony. We lost 2 men that day, including young Davis, who had just turned 19. As night fell, we managed to establish a defensible position in a complex of buildings near the river. It was the first time we had a moment to process the day's events. Each soldier's face told a different story of shock, fear, and determination. Sergeant Rodriguez passed between us, checking ammunition and morale. "This is just the beginning, Marines," he said in his characteristic calm voice. "Tomorrow we'll have to do it all over again, and we need to be ready." That night, lying in my makeshift combat post, watching the explosions light up the night sky over Hue, I realized that our war had fundamentally changed. We were no longer patrolling jungles or rice fields. We were fighting a brutal urban battle that would test every aspect of our training and humanity. The distant sound of gunfire and explosions formed a morbid symphony that would accompany us for days to come. Each of us knew that dawn would bring new challenges, new horrors, and, inevitably, more losses. But at that moment, all we could do was mentally prepare ourselves for what would come next. The Battle of Hue was just beginning, and none of us could have imagined how much it would change our lives forever. The weight of that first day still stays with me, decades later, as a constant reminder of the human cost of war. Dawn brought with it an even more brutal reality than the day before. As I checked my M16, I realized that my hands were still trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that was still coursing through my veins after the previous intense 24 hours. Sergeant Rodriguez assembled our unit before sunrise. Our mission today is to clear the southern sector of the Citadel, he informed us, pointing to a worn map. The Citadel was the historic heart of Hue, a complex of old imperial buildings that now served as a stronghold for the North Vietnamese forces. O'Brien approached me as we checked our equipment. "Hey, Bradley, get some more grenades. We almost ran out of them at the temple yesterday." His advice was valuable. Urban combat consumed ammunition at an alarming rate, and each grenade could mean the difference between life and death. We moved methodically through the city. Hue's narrow streets had become a deadly labyrinth. Every corner demanded a cautious approach. Every window could hide a sniper. The constant sound of gunfire and explosions had become our macabre soundtrack. Our first major resistance of the day came from a school complex. The three-story building, once dedicated to teaching, was now an enemy command post. Rodriguez divided the platoon into two teams. One to flank from the west, the other to create a frontal distraction. "Maintain constant visual contact," Rodriguez ordered. "They know this place better than we do." I was assigned to the flanking team with O'Brien and 3 other Marines. We moved silently around the back of the compound, while the sound of gunfire from the front team echoed off the walls. The interior of the school was a silent testament to how quickly the war had come. Overturned desks served as barricades. Blackboards still displayed half-formed lessons. In one room, I found a children's notebook with colorful drawings, a sight that would haunt me for years. The fighting inside the building was intense and confusing. The narrow corridors amplified every sound, making it impossible to determine where the shots were coming from. We lost Corporal Martinez in a corridor on the 2nd floor to a sharp blast through an ajar door. There was no time to mourn. The fighting continued. Bredjedi, grenade, shote O'Brien. I threw a fragmentation grenade through a window from which enemy fire was coming. The explosion was followed by momentary silence, then shouts in Vietnamese. We advanced room by room, floor by floor, in a deadly dance of advances and retreats. On the 3rd floor, we found their command center. Detailed maps of Hue covered the walls, markers indicating positions and planned movements. Rodriguez photographed everything with a camera that always carried valuable information for the command. One striking moment came when we found a wounded North Vietnamese soldier. He must have been no more than 18 years old. Our medic, Doc Wilson, treated his wounds despite orders to evacuate the building. "We don't leave anyone behind, even if it's the enemy," he said, applying a tourniquet to the young soldier. As the day progressed, fatigue began to take its toll. Urban combat was exhausting. Every move had to be calculated. Every decision could be fatal. Sweat dripped down our helmets, mixing with the dust and soot that covered our faces. Rodriguez kept our morale high with his calm way of leading. "Every clean block is a step closer to home, Marines," he would say. But we all knew that Hue would not be retaken easily. The Viet Cong had prepared meticulously for this battle. By the end of that day, we had managed to establish a defensive line further south of the Citadel. As we organized our supplies and prepared positions for the night, O'Brien shared his instant coffee with me, a rare luxury in those circumstances. "You know, Bradley," he said, blowing on the hot coffee, "when I enlisted, I figured I'd be fighting in the jungle, not in an old city like this." His observation perfectly captured our situation. No amount of training had adequately prepared us for this kind of warfare. Night fell over Hue, but the fighting didn't stop. Sporadic gunfire and distant explosions constantly reminded us that the battle was far from over. On my guard duty, observing the ruins of the ancient city under the moonlight, I reflected on how that historic place had been transformed into a brutal battlefield. 2 days at the Battle of Hue had already changed our perspective on war. It was no longer a question of ideologies or politics. It was a fight for survival, meter by meter, building by building. And we still had a lot of ground to cover. The 3rd morning in Hue began with a disturbing silence. Sergeant Rodriguez warned us that this usually meant the enemy was regrouping or planning something big. As I checked my equipment, I noticed that my hands were no longer shaking. The constant combat had turned us into war machines, for better or worse. "Bradley, we need to take that hospital," said Rodriguez. pointing to a large white building 3 blocks away. Intelligence indicated that the North Vietnamese had turned the place into a secondary command center, using the patients as human shields. O'Brien and I were assigned to lead the first reconnaissance group. The streets were strangely deserted, except for the wreckage and bodies we hadn't yet been able to recover. The smell of decay was beginning to mix with the humid city air, creating a nauseating atmosphere. "Keep your eyes on the rooftops," Rodriguez whispered over the radio. Our experience over the last few days had taught us that Viet Cong snipers preferred elevated positions. Every step was calculated. Every movement had to be silent. As we approached the hospital, we realized why the command had chosen that objective. The building offered a clear view of much of the city, including our supply lines. Doc Wilson, our doctor, was particularly tense. The idea of a confrontation in a hospital went against everything he stood for. The first contact came from an abandoned ambulance. A burst of gunfire forced our group to scatter, seeking cover wherever possible. O'Brien and I took cover behind a partially destroyed wall, while Rodriguez coordinated our response over the radio. "We need mortar support," shouted Rodriguez. But the command response was negative. Too much risk of collateral damage with civilians in hospital. We would have to do it the hard way, room by room, corridor by corridor. Entering the hospital was a tactical nightmare. The main lobby had been turned into a fortress, with sandbags on the windows and strategically placed firing positions. Our advance was slow and methodical, every corner representing a possible ambush. On the second floor, we met the first civilian patients and hospital staff who hadn't managed to evacuate. Their eyes reflected a mixture of fear and hope when they saw us. Doc Wilson immediately began to assess those most in need, while we maintained our defensive position. There on the 4th floor, reported a local nurse in broken English. "Too many soldiers, too many weapons." Rodriguez reorganized our unit, leaving one team to protect the civilians while the rest of us continued the advance. The 3rd floor was where we lost Peterson. A grenade went through a window, exploding near our position. O'Brien tried to reach him, but it was too late. Rodriguez kept us focused. There was no time to grieve in the middle of the fight. When we finally reached the 4th floor, we encountered heavy resistance. The North Vietnamese had turned the surgical ward into a makeshift bunker. Combat in such confined spaces was brutal and personal. Every room conquered cost blood on both sides. "Bradley on the right," shouted O'Brien, saving my life when an enemy soldier emerged from a supply closet. The shot passed so close that I felt the displacement of air. I responded instinctively, and another young soldier fell in that senseless war. The battle for the hospital lasted hours, but it felt like an eternity. When we finally secured the building, the sun was already setting. Rodriguez immediately organized a defensive perimeter, knowing that counterattacks would come during the night. Doc Wilson worked tirelessly, treating both our wounded and the civilians. "War is war," he would say, "but a patient is a patient." His humanity in the midst of chaos was a reminder of what we were fighting to preserve. That night, during my guard shift, I watched the city of Hue from the hospital window. The occasional explosions lit up the horizon like distant lightning. O'Brien joined me, sharing his last cigarette. "Do you think it's worth it?" he asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I didn't answer immediately, watching a group of refugees being escorted by other Marines towards the safe zone. O'Brien's question went unanswered, but we both knew that we were no longer fighting for grandiose ideals or distant politics. We were fighting for survival, for the person next to us, and for the innocents trapped in this urban hell. Rodriguez walked past our position, checking each man as he always did. "Tomorrow will be another day," he said, his voice conveying a calm that we all needed. "And we need to be ready for whatever comes." The Battle of Hue was far from over, and each day brought new challenges, new horrors, and new scars that we would carry forever. But that night, in the silence interrupted only by distant gunfire, we found a moment of precarious peace, knowing that dawn would bring another day of fighting for survival. The 4th day in Hue began with a disturbing discovery. During our morning patrol, we found documents indicating that the attack on the city had been planned for months. Sergeant Rodriguez studied the papers carefully, his face hardening with each page. "They know every inch of this city," he said, passing the documents to the commando, "and they planned every move in advance." This information changed our perspective on the battle. We weren't just facing guerrillas, but a well-organized and prepared army. O'Brien and I were assigned to lead a reconnaissance mission towards the Central Market. The area was strategic, as it controlled several supply routes. As we moved through the narrow alleyways, I noticed how the city had changed in just 4 days. Stores that once sold spices and textiles were now just burnt-out shelves. "Keep your distance between yourselves," Rodriguez ordered over the radio. "Reports indicate that they've started using booby traps in the abandoned buildings." This new tactic made our progress even slower and more cautious. The first sign of trouble came when we found the bodies of civilians in a side street. Doc Wilson, who was with us that morning, quickly examined the victims. "Executions," he muttered, his voice shaking with anger. "All shot in the back of the head." Rodriguez documented the scene with his camera, but his eyes revealed a restrained fury. "Keep moving," he ordered. "We can't help them now, but we can stop it happening again." As we approached the market, the silence was deafening. Not even birds dared to make a sound. O'Brien signaled that there was movement on the second floor of a building ahead of us. We split into 2 teams to flank the position. That's when everything went wrong. An explosion in the building next door took us by surprise. The shock wave threw me against a wall, temporarily disorienting me. Through the smoke, I heard the shouts of my companions and the distinctive sound of AK-47s. "Bradley, on your left!" shouted O'Brien. I turned in time to see 3 North Vietnamese soldiers emerging from a cellar. The ensuing combat was fast and brutal. My M16 responded automatically, years of training taking over. Rodriguez coordinated our defense with his usual efficiency, but we were at a disadvantage. The enemy had prepared this ambush meticulously, with firing positions covering all the escape routes. "We need air support," shouted Rodriguez on the radio. The answer came quickly. No aircraft available due to bad weather. We were on our own. Doc Wilson worked frantically to keep Peterson alive after he was shot in the chest. "Stay with me, kid," he murmured as he applied a pressure bandage. The young Marine from Minnesota, who always talked about going back to his family's farm, closed his eyes for the last time on that destroyed street in Hio. The battle for the market lasted hours. Every meter gained cost blood and sweat. O'Brien was hit in the arm, but kept fighting, his determination unwavering. Rodriguez led a counterattack that finally gave us the advantage. When we finally secured the area, the sun was already low on the horizon. The market, once a vibrant center of commerce, was now just another urban battlefield. Among the rubble, we found evidence that the site had served as a supply distribution center for the North Vietnamese forces. "This explains why they defended it so fiercely," commented Rodriguez, examining boxes of ammunition and medicines. "It was a vital point for their operations." That night, as we organized our defensive positions, I reflected on how each day in this battle changed us a little more. The idealistic young man who had arrived in Vietnam months before was gradually being replaced by something different. A soldier hardened by the brutal reality of urban warfare. O'Brien, his arm bandaged, sat next to me during my guard shift. "Do you know what's hardest?" he asked, his voice low. "It's seeing an entire city dying little by little. It's not just the people, it's the very soul of the place that's being destroyed." Rodriguez walked past us, making his usual rounds. "Tomorrow we'll try to reach the university," he informed us. "Intelligence says they've turned the campus into a fortress." I watched the stars through the smoke that still hung over the city. Somewhere beyond that urban hell, life was still normal. But for us in Hue, each dawn brought only the promise of more fighting, more losses, and more memories that would haunt us forever. The 5th day in the battle for Hue began with a mission that none of us expected. An urgent message from command informed us of a group of civilians trapped in a religious complex near the university. Rodriguez assembled our unit before dawn, his eyes carrying the weight of responsibility. "We need to get to them before the enemy uses them as human shields," he explained, tracing our route on the map. O'Brien, his arm still bandaged from the day before, insisted on taking part in the mission. "I'm not staying behind, Sarge," he said, checking his M16 with determination. We moved through the streets in tight formation, each man covering a specific sector. The city had turned into a maze of destruction, bullet-riddled walls, charred vehicles, and the inevitable signs of combat everywhere. The occasional silence was more frightening than the sound of gunfire. "Movement at 2 o'clock, whispered Jenkins, our new sniper after the loss of Peterson. Through my scope, I saw shadows moving among the ruins, impossible to determine whether they were civilians or combatants. Rodriguez signaled for us to hold position. The religious complex was only 2 blocks away when all hell broke loose. Bursts of automatic fire came from multiple directions. "Ambush!" shouted O'Brien as we scattered for cover. The experience of the last few days had kept us alive, and each man knew exactly what to do. Doc Wilson worked frantically to stabilize Jenkins, hit early in the confrontation. "Keep pressure here," he instructed a young Marine, his hands already covered in blood. Rodriguez coordinated our response by radio, requesting mortar support for suppression. The fighting intensified when we discovered that we were trapped between 2 enemy units. "We need to make our way to that building," ordered Rodriguez, pointing to a concrete structure that offered a better defensive position. O'Brien and I led the advance, covering each other in short, precise movements. The adrenaline masked the pain and tiredness in those moments. We were pure determination and instinct. Every meter gained was a small victory. Inside the building, we found disturbing evidence. Scattered documents revealed detailed enemy plans to use civilians as human shields in various parts of the city. Rodriguez methodically photographed everything, his expression hardening with each discovery. "We need to get to those civilians," Doc Wilson insisted, always focused on the humanitarian aspect of our mission. Rodriguez agreed, reorganizing our unit for the next move. The distant sound of explosions marked the rhythm of our progress. The religious complex finally appeared in our vision, an old Buddhist monastery converted into a fortress. Through binoculars, we identified movement on the upper floors. "That's them," confirmed Rodriguez, observing civilians waving discreetly through the windows. Our approach was meticulous. O'Brien identified several booby traps on the perimeter where the North Vietnamese had prepared the ground for our arrival. "They knew we were coming," he muttered, carefully disarming an explosive device. Rescuing the civilians turned into a complex operation. While part of our unit maintained suppression, another group guided the refugees out of the complex. Among them were children, the elderly and the wounded, each face scarred by the terror of the last few days. An elderly woman grabbed my arm as I helped her move. "Thank you," she said in broken English, her eyes conveying more than words could express. That moment reminded me why we were there. It wasn't just a battle for territory, but for humanity itself. The day ended with our unit setting up a defensive perimeter around the rescued civilians. Rodriguez organized guard shifts while Doc Wilson attended to the wounded. O'Brien, exhausted but vigilant, shared his last chocolate bar with some children. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be able to forget all this," said O'Brien during our guard shift. I watched the ruins of Hugh in the moonlight, thinking about his post. "Maybe we shouldn't forget," I replied. "Someone needs to remember and tell that story." Rodriguez passed our position, his familiar silhouette bringing a sense of security. "Tomorrow we move at dawn," he informed us. "Command wants all civilians evacuated before the next big push." The night took its course, punctuated by distant explosions and occasional bursts of gunfire. Each sound echoed through the ancient city, reminding us that the battle for Hugh was far from over. But that night, at least, we had made a difference to some people's lives. When I think back to the 6th day in Hugh, the memories blend into a haze of exhaustion and determination. Rodriguez woke us up before dawn. We had to evacuate the rescued civilians and then take part in the final advance towards the citadel. The weight of responsibility weighed heavily on each of us. "Bradley, you and O'Brien lead the first group," ordered Rodriguez, his voice hoarse after days of constant commands. The civilians were divided into smaller groups to facilitate movement through the destroyed streets. Doc Wilson insisted on keeping the most seriously wounded in the last group. The sky was still dark when we began the evacuation. The silence was broken only by the muffled sound of footsteps and occasional distant explosions. A small girl held my hand tightly as she led her group, her large eyes reflecting a fear that no child should know. O'Brien limped slightly, his injured arm still bothering him, but he refused to show any sign of weakness. "Keep your eyes on the rooftops," he whispered, as we moved methodically through the ruined streets. Our progress was interrupted by gunfire coming from a commercial building. Instinctively, we formed a perimeter around the civilians. Rodriguez coordinated our response by radio while we tried to identify the enemy positions. "We need to get these people out of here," shouted Doc Wilson, protecting a wounded elderly man. The fighting that followed was unlike anything we had faced so far. We weren't just fighting for territory, but for the lives of the innocent people under our protection. A nearby explosion wounded 3 civilians and knocked O'Brien to the ground. I ran over to him, my heart hammering in my chest. "I'm fine," he mumbled, getting up with difficulty. "Keep moving." Rodriguez reorganized our formation, placing the strongest in the outer protection while the wounded were carried to the center of the group. The sound of approaching helicopters brought a moment of hope that we would finally have air support. The evacuation of civilians took up most of the morning. Every block presented new challenges. Every corner could hide a threat. When we finally reached the safe zone, the look of relief on the refugees' faces made all the effort worthwhile. "Now comes the hard part," said Rodriguez, rallying the unit for our next objective, the final assault on the citadel. The documents found in the previous days had revealed that this would be the enemy's last fortified position in Hio. The attack began at midday. The deafening sound of artillery marked our approach as we advanced through the devastated city. The ancient walls of the citadel, which had protected emperors for centuries, were now the last bastion of North Vietnamese resistance. The fighting was brutal and relentless. Every meter gained cost American and Vietnamese blood. O'Brien was hit again, this time more seriously. "Don't leave me behind," he begged as Doc Wilson worked frantically to stop the bleeding. "Nobody gets left behind," Rodriguez replied, organizing a team to protect the medical evacuation. I watched as my friend was carried away from the fighting, his still form reminding me of everyone we had lost in this hellish battle. The hours dragged by as we fought room by room, corridor by corridor. The citadel was a labyrinth of history and death, each corner holding centuries of memory, now stained by the blood of a new war. As the sun began to set, we finally reached the heart of the citadel. The silence that followed was more deafening than any explosion. Rodriguez signaled our final approach, his precise movements reflecting years of experience. "It's over," he announced simply, after confirming that the last point of resistance had fallen. I looked around at the exhausted faces of my fellow survivors. We were different from the young men who had entered Hughes 6 days earlier. The next morning, as the sun rose over a devastated city, I went on one last patrol with Rodriguez. "You know, Bradley," he said, his voice carrying the weight of all the days before, "wars like this leave scars that go beyond what we can see." Today, decades later, I still sometimes wake up hearing the sound of Hio. I think of O'Brien, who survived but was never the same, of Rodriguez, who continued to lead until his last day in Vietnam, and of all the others we left behind on those old streets. The Battle of Hue changed not only the course of the war, but also the lives of every person who fought in it. We carry their memories as invisible scars, constant reminders of the human cost of the conflict. When I visited Hue years later, I found a city reborn from the ashes of war. But for those of us who fought on its streets in 1968, it will always be remembered as those 6 days of urban hell that tested not only our courage and determination, but also our very humanity.